Mrs. Shobana Subramanian graduated with a gold medal and additionally was the best outgoing student in her Bachelor's of Architecture batch. Mrs. Shobana, working as a senior architect at the Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. She has worked on various projects including hospitals, office buildings, residential, recreational to institutional projects. She has also attended 4 national conferences, 1 international conference and an international Indo-French workshop initiated by the UN Heritage on the urban morphology and architectural typology of the Karekudi Heritage, Chettinad.
Welcome to UGC lecture series for B Architecture. Today we are looking at the lecture for Building Materials 2 subject, Unit 5 Paint and Varnishing in Timber. This is lecture 2 for Unit 5. In the previous lecture, we saw what is paint, what it is composed of, how it is manufactured and what are the different types of paints. While in this lecture, we will be looking a little bit more into detail of protective coatings, where we will be looking at primer, varnishes, enamels and how to paint, how to prepare a surface for painting and how to paint different surfaces, and finally we will be seeing what are the defects in paints. Protective coatings. When we talk about protective coatings or paints, a lot of technical jargons, a lot of words are thrown around like paints, varnishes, you would have heard primer, distemper, enamel. What are all these? All these are a type of protective coat. While we saw paints in the earlier lecture, paints are a non-transparent and colored coating, while varnishes are transparent and they do not have any color. They might give a little bit of a dark reddish or brownish tint or yellowish tint to the final product, but then they don't have any color on their own. Primer is the first coating applied to the surface in order to enhance the adhesion of the final paint or top coat and to seal the substrate surface. Primer may be formulated to impart additional protection to the substrate. While enamel is a hard protective coating with glossy finish. You can use enamels for metals, wood and even walls. When used in wood, since enamel is a solid color, you won't be able to see the natural grains of the wood, while in varnish you can see that. And distemper is a paint again, is usually available in powdered form and it is the most widely used type of wall paints nowadays. Now let us see primer. What is a primer? Primer or undercoat is a preparatory coat to be put on materials before painting. Primer not only prepares the surface to be painted on, it also increases the absorption of the surface so that it absorbs the coating, that subsequent coatings properly, and the painting the final painted product has good durability and strength. Now, why do we need primer? Priming ensures better adhesion of paint to the surface, increases paint durability, provides additional protection for the material being painted. Usually primer's composition are as follows. It has 20 to 30% synthetic resin, 60 to 80% solvent and 2 to 5% additive agent. Some primer contain polythene, which is plastic, for better durability. Now, do not underestimate the importance of primer. A primer prepares the surface for the finish coat. It is sometimes impossible to achieve satisfactory results without first priming the surface. Primers do not need to be engineered to have durable finished surfaces because they are instead engineered to have improved filling and binding properties with the materials underneath. We should always use primers on these types of surfaces, the following types of surfaces. Raw wood, the primer seals the pesky resins. You should definitely use primers on raw drywall. Drywall means gypsum board drywall. Primer seeps into the paper and provides a smooth paint surface, also better adhesion for the final coat. You should use primer for patched walls, raw metal, rough surfaces. Rough surfaces, the primer will help make these surfaces smoother so that paint can be easily applied on those surfaces. And finally, primer must be used for stained surfaces. It sort of masks the stains to a certain extent. Now, let us focus on primer for woods. Wood is a very porous and will absorb the solvent from paint, drying the paint prematurely. So, several layers of paint can be necessary to completely obscure the wood grain and even ensure even color. Now, wood is exposed to moisture. A thin layer of paint will still be water permeable. To end result will be a defected parts, defective paint. Now, primer adds to the waterproofing effect of the paint. So, for this reason, primer is very important when you are painting or giving a protective coat to the paint. Now, quality primers are often comparable to price in finished paints, the cost influenced by the quality of binders that they use. For natural wood grains, primers are not necessary for a wood stain treatment that is designed to show the wood grain, because you have varnish and varnish itself will act as a primer. The first coat of varnish you put, it will itself act as a primer. On soft woods, a wood conditioner like thin shellac or varnish allows for more even coloring of the stain. Now, this promotes uniform finishes and they are designed with qualities that promote quick drying as well. So, you saw for woods, in case you are using varnishes, you do not need paints. Using a stain treatment, you do not need primer, but when you are using opaque protective coatings for woods, you definitely need a primer before you coat it with a final coat. Now, primer for metals. Why do we need primer for metals? Again, it is for better adhesion. Additional reason for using a primer on metal could be the poor condition of the surface. Metal surfaces may not be having a plain surface or may have some bit of corrosion and dirt on top, which should be all completely cleared. Metal primers might contain additional materials to protect against corrosion, such as sacrificial zinc. Where is primer given for metal? Not all metal surfaces require primer. Primer is highly recommended for parts exposed to moisture only. A steel part can be rusty, for example. Of course, the best solution is to thoroughly clean the metal. But when this is not a viable option, special kinds of primers can be used that chemically convert rust to the solid metal salts. And even though such surface is still lacking in comparison to the shiny clean metal, it is yet much better than a weak porous rust. Now, let us see varnish. Varnish is a transparent hard protective finish or film that is primarily used in wood finishing, but also for certain other materials. Characteristics of a varnish should be it should dry very rapidly. The drying and curing time of all varnishes may be sped up by exposure to an energy source such as sunlight or heat. Varnish should form a hard film on drying. It should not crack on drying. It should be durable and weather resistant. It should give a uniform and pleasing appearance. It should not hide the natural grains of the wood. Varnish is not a opaque protective coating. It should not hide the natural grains of the wood. That is the main purpose of using varnish. Varnish are glossy, but you may design a special type of semi-gloss or matte finish varnish by adding flattening agents. Varnish has little to no color. It is completely transparent and has no added pigments. It can be applied over wood stains as a final step to achieve a film for gloss and for protection. Some products are marketed as a combined stain and varnish. Now, varnish is a traditional combination of a drying oil, a resin and a thinner or solvent. So, basically varnish contains three major components: drying oil, a resin or binder, and lastly thinner or solvent. It does not contain any pigment. You can add additives to the varnish to increase its certain characteristics, like you can increase the surface gloss, or you can have a matte finish varnish. So, for that you can add additives, but majorly only three components are there. Types of varnish. Let us see what are the different types of varnishes available. Violin. Violin varnishing is a multi-step process involving some or all of the following: primer, sealer, ground color, coats and clear top coat. Some systems use a drying oil varnish as described below, while others used spirit or varnish. Resin. Most resin or gum varnishes consist of a natural plant or insect derived substance dissolved in a solvent called spirit varnish or solvent varnish. The solvent may be alcohol, turpentine or petroleum based. Shellac is a very widely used single component resin varnish that is alcohol soluble. It is not used for outdoor surfaces and where it will come into repeated contact with water, such as around a sink or bathtub. Alkyd. Modern commercially produced varnishes employ some form of alkyd for producing a protective film. Alkyds are chemically modified vegetable oils which operate well in a wide range of conditions and can be engineered to speed up the cure rate and thus harden faster. They are better and more expensive exterior varnishes employ alkyds made from higher performance oils and contain UV absorbers. Spar varnish, also called marine varnish, was originally intended for use on ship or boat spars to protect the timber from the effects of sea and weather. Spar bends under the load of their sails. Drying oils, by definition, drying oils such as linseed and tung oil are not true varnishes, though often in modern terms they accomplish the same thing. Drying oils cure through an exothermic reaction between the polyunsaturated portion of the oil and oxygen from the air. Polyurethane varnishes are typically hard, abrasion resistant and durable coatings. They are popular for hardwood floors but are considered by some wood finishers to be difficult or unsuitable for finishing furniture or other detailed pieces. The word lacquer refers to quick drying solvent based varnishes or paints. Although the names may be similarly derived, lacquer is not the same as shellac and is not dissolved in alcohol. Lacquer is typically sprayed on. Acrylic varnishes are typically waterborne varnishes with the lowest refractive index of all finished and high transparency. They resist yellowing. Acrylics have the advantage of water cleanup and lack of solvent fumes, but typically do not penetrate into wood as well as oils. They sometimes lack the brushability and self-leveling qualities of soil-based varnishes. Enamel. What is enamel? Enamel paint is a paint that air dries to a hard, usually glossy finish and used for coating surfaces that are outdoors or otherwise subject to hard wear and tear or variations in temperature. Enamel is quite durable. Enamels are normally applied by brushing, although they can be also be sprayed. Drying time, enamel comparatively takes a longer time to dry. Hence, care must be taken to ensure that there is a dust-free environment during when the enamel is drying. 2 coats of enamel paint is sufficient in most cases for the first time painting. For existing painting surfaces, if the existing paint is a darker shade, significantly darker shade than the new enamel paint, then we need a little extra coat to just mask the darker color. We saw what is primers, varnishes and enamels. Now we will see how to paint. Painting basically consists of the following steps. Preparing the surface. We have to prepare the surface. Why? Because a well prepared surface will take in the paint in a better way. So, preparing the surface majorly means just cleaning the surface of all the dirt or any grease on top. For a wall, it can be, for existing wall, the existing paint can be scraped off. For a metal, the rust can be removed, and for a wood, it can be sanded, or if there are any knots or defects, it can be filled with a putty. So, the final prepared surface should be completely plain. Next, priming. Priming or applying primer is a very important step in the preparation. Now, if you do not apply priming, the surface that is to be painted on might not accept the coat, accept the protective coat or accept the final coat as readily as it will if it is primed. Usually it is recommended to prime or give a priming coat to all kinds of surfaces before you start painting it, but then some surfaces do not need priming. But when we are talking and we are focusing mostly on wood and painting and varnishes on wood, it is when you are using varnishes, you do not need to prime because varnishes acts as a primer. But when you are using enamel paint or a wood, any other wood paint which is an opaque paint, then it is best to prime the wood before you apply those paints. Then applying the coats of paint. The coats can be minimum coat required is 2 coats, which is first done in one direction and the second coat is done in the opposite direction, such that there are in the final product does not have any brush mark. Both the horizontal and the vertical brush mark merge with each other and become a plain plain film. So, and you can apply if you're not satisfied with the color intensity that you get from applying the coat, you can keep applying the coat again and again to get the proper color intensity. Finally, applying the top coat. So, you have priming, which is the base coat, then you have the intermediate coat, and finally the top coat. The top coat can be a decorative coat. Usually a top coat is kind of acts as a sealant, where it completely seals off the painted surface from external factors, and top coat should also be of very good quality because it is coat which withstands maximum wear and tear. Painting on wood. Now, in this lecture we are focusing on majorly wood and painting on wood. So, how do we paint on wood? What is the process of painting on wood? Step 1, you have to prepare the surface. The new wood should be seasoned and dried before painting. And unseasoned, if you paint on an unseasoned wood, it will not work because there is already trapped moisture inside the wood, which will not let the wood interact well with the paint. The surface of the wood should be cleaned. If there are any nails on the top of the surface, on the surface of the wood, it should be punched in such that the final surface you get is plain. Step 2 is knotting. Knotting is basically if there are any knots, then they should be covered with suitable material, or if there are any defects or chipping, or if there is any dents in the wood, they should be covered with putty or suitable material such that the whole surface you get is completely plain. Then you should apply the first coat, that is step 3. After knotting and the primary coat is applied on the surface of the wood, usually this first coat is applied before the wood is fixed. Now, why should we apply this coat before the wood is fixed? Why can't we just completely finish the woodwork and then paint on top? Now, what happens is, for example, if this is you have an edge and you're painting after the woodwork is finished, you might miss the edge, and the wood might get defected or get attacked by insects or fungi from the edge. So, you have to protect the edge as well. That is why it is recommended that you completely paint the wood and then before doing the woodwork, such that all the corners and all the edges of the wood are well protected. Now, step 4 is to apply the second coat. Now, this coat is applied after the priming coat. Each coat should be applied longitudinally in thin film and cross so that no brush mark is seen on the painted surface. Like I told before, if you are applying the first coat vertically, then the next coat should be horizontal. Usually the first coat that is applied parallel to the grain of the wood. Step 5 is the final step, and that is to apply the final coat. This coat is applied over the intermediate coats without no brush mark. You should be very careful in applying this coat such that there are no brush marks, and and you should be also applying the enough amount of protective coat on the woodwork. If you take very little amount of paint, it might dry too fast and you might find the brush marks on the surface. When you are painting a wood with enamel, there is a different procedure than when you paint the wood with a varnish. What we saw earlier was when you paint with varnish. Now, when you are painting with enamel, if the surface is already painted or varnished, remove the dirt or wax buildup with a household cleaner and rinse. Now, sand through areas and wipe away dust with a tack cloth. Apply 2 coats of stain blocking primer and allow it to dry between coats. Now that the priming is done, now you have to move on to applying the enamel. Now, roll or brush on 2 coats of enamel paint in the direction of the wood grain. Use a brush to finish the surface with smooth strokes. For furniture or cabinetry that will receive heavy use, like kitchen cabinets that are opened on a daily basis, it is a good idea to seal the finish with 2 coats of polyurethane. So, you saw when with this you have to apply 2 coats of priming, with enamel you have to put 2 coats of primer. Now, we saw how to prepare a surface for painting and what are the different types of various ways of painting different surfaces. Now, let us see defects in paints. Now, the common defects that are found in paints are blistering. Blistering, like you see in the image, it is a formation of bubbles like shapes on the painted surface. Now, this primary cause of this defect is water vapor. When water vapor is trapped under the paint layer, it creates bubbles under the film or paint. Because of the heat, this water which is trapped becomes vapor and it forms these bubbles. Blooming. Blooming is the formation of dull patches on the painted surface. Now, the primary cause of this defect is poor quality of paint and improper ventilation. Fading. Fading, when there is a gradual loss of color from the painted surface, it is known as fading. The main cause of this defect is the reaction of sunlight on pigments of paint. So, if paint is of not a very good quality and does not have a very good duration, then during a long course of time it will start fading. Flaking. Flaking is a very common type of defect that happens because of improperly skilled labor. In this type of defect, some portion of the paint film is not sticked properly with the surface, resulting in flaking of the paint layer. This is caused due to poor adhesion between paint and the surface to be painted. So, this is an example of not doing the priming properly. If you do not do the priming properly, if you do not prepare the surface to be painted properly, then the paint that is to be applied on the surface will not have a good adhesion with the substrate. So, it will cause flaking. Flashing. Presence of glossy patches on the painted surface is known as flashing. The cause of this defect is mainly due to poor workmanship, cheap paint or weather conditions. The next type of paint defect is called grinning. If the thickness of the final coat of paint becomes very thin, the background can be seen clearly. So, this is known as grinning. Obviously, the cause of grinning is poor workmanship, and this can be rectified by applying a more uniform layer of final coat, and which is thicker than the previously wrongly applied coat. Next type of defect in paints is running. This type of defect is seen when the surface to be painted is very smooth. In case of smooth surfaces, the paint runs back and leaves small areas of surfaces uncovered. So, like you see in this image, if you apply paint on very smooth surface, this you might also see when you pour water over a very smooth surfaces, the water gathers at certain places, leaving certain pockets empty. This is what happens with paint also. The paints leave certain pockets which are not covered with paint. This type of defect is called running. Sagging. This type of defect is more prominent when a thick layer of paint is applied on a vertical or inclined surface. So, like you see in this image, when you apply a very thick layer of paint, the paint tends to run down or sag, and while it is sagging or while it is running down, it dries off. So, even if you try to rectify this defect by painting on top of it with another coat, sometimes the sagged paint is so thick that you cannot rectify it. Saponification. Saponification is the formation of soap patches on the painted surface, and this is chemical action of alkalis is the cause of this defect. If the surface which was supposed to be painted, if it had some trapped salts in it, and when it is painted, because of the heat, the salts are released to the surface and it reacts with the paint on the surface, and the defects like saponification happens. Wrinkling. This type of defect is more prominent when a thick layer of paint is applied on a horizontal surface. This image you see, the paint actually this happens also because of improper and ununiform drying. If some portion of the paint or some pockets of the paint dry quicker than the rest, this wrinkling happens. One reason for this is the quality of the paint is not that good, and the second reason is the workmanship is poor, because of which this wrinkling happens. Now, we have reached the end of this video. We learned the following from this lecture. In our attempt to save or protect surfaces from weathering actions, paints were invented. Now, later on, additional value addition of aesthetics also came into the paints. Now, in this lecture, we saw the types of protective coatings like primer, varnish, enamels, its specific applications, what kind of paint to use where, and how to apply paints, how to prepare the paints, and how to apply paints, how to prepare the surfaces for paints, and what are the defects in paints. From your understanding of this lecture, can you answer the following question? Do a market study of the available varnishes and their costs. And what can we do to avoid defects in painting? What is the difference between enamels and varnishes, and how is distemper different from primer? With this, we have reached the end. Thank you.